Right now, there's a new pool of vigorously boiling, gray, silt-filled water sitting in Yellowstone's Biscuit Basin that did not exist 3 days earlier. Opened up in a spot geologists themselves had been standing on just 48 hours before, and has already been photographed shooting water 20 to 30 feet into the air. That is exactly the kind of detail that tends to go viral with a caption suggesting Yellowstone's supervolcano is stirring. It is also, according to the actual scientists at the United States Geological Survey, who study the system for a living, not what is happening here at all. This is the story of the new pool that formed in Biscuit Basin after this summer's second hydrothermal explosion, what USGS geologists on the ground actually found when they went to investigate it, and why they are being explicit that this specific pool is not a sign that something bigger is building underneath Yellowstone, at least not based on anything the data currently shows. No hype, no exaggeration, just what actually happened and what the scientists studying it are actually saying. Drop a comment and tell me if you have ever visited Biscuit Basin, because I read every one of these. If you want grounded science coverage instead of panic headlines, subscribe. It is free, and a like helps this reach people who need the real explanation instead of the scary thumbnail. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. To understand where this new pool came from, you have to start with the explosion that preceded it. Shortly after 5 in the morning on the 13th of June this year, monitoring equipment installed in Biscuit Basin registered seismic energy and infrasound, a low-frequency acoustic signal coming from the direction of Black Diamond Pool, the same general spot where a much larger hydrothermal explosion had torn through the area back in July of 2024. A research camera captured the moment directly, showing a dark-colored steam plume jetting out of the ground just north of the pool. Compared to the 2024 event, which threw debris 400 to 600 feet into the air and destroyed a section of boardwalks, this explosion was notably smaller. It left behind a fissure roughly 18.5 meters, about 61 feet long, filled with near-boiling water, along with 2 new runoff channels feeding a light gray milky plume of sediment downstream into the Firehole River. Geologists from Yellowstone's own geology team visited the site the following day, on the 14th of June, to survey the damage and begin figuring out exactly what had happened. Then they left, planning to return later to continue monitoring the area. When they came back on the 16th of June, only 2 days later, they found something that had not been there during their first visit, a new thermal pool, roughly 21 feet by 17 feet, filled with vigorously boiling, gray, silt-like water, sitting in almost the exact spot where the geology team had been, standing and walking just 2 days earlier, because the ground around the new pool showed no scattered rocks or debris, the kind of material you would expect to find if the pool had been blasted open by another explosion. The team concluded it, most likely, formed through collapse instead, the ground simply giving way into an underlying cavity, rather than being violently ejected outward. 2 days after that, on the 18th of June, the pool began showing signs of intermittent spouting, shooting hot water an estimated 20 to 30 feet into the air at irregular intervals, exactly the kind of visual that tends to spread fast online, usually stripped of any of the context that explains it. This is exactly where it becomes worth asking directly what USGS scientists actually said about it, rather than what a viral clip implies. Michael Poland, geophysicist and scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, addressed the new pool specifically, and his framing was notably calm. New pools, like this one, he explained, form several times each year across Yellowstone. Usually that happens unnoticed, out in the park's vast backcountry, far from any trail, road, or webcam. Every now and then, Poland said, one of these forms in a front country area, somewhere park staff and visitors can actually observe it happening in close to real time, and this was simply one of those occasions. Critically, Poland was direct about what a new pool does and does not indicate on its own. It doesn't always mean something big is going to happen, he said, treating the new pool as a genuinely routine, if visually dramatic, feature of how Yellowstone's shallow hydrothermal plumbing regularly behaves, rather than as evidence of a bigger building event underneath it. That framing lines up with what scientists observed when they checked the surroundings area for any sign the disturbance was spreading. Black Diamond Pool itself, sitting just a few hundred feet from the new pool and the newly formed vent system, showed no observed changes at all during the same window when the new pool was forming and beginning to spout. Poland made a point of addressing a common misconception directly, that one explosion or one new feature forming must necessarily affect every other geothermal feature nearby. In this case, he said, the mini-explosion and the new pool that followed it were local, confined to a small area, and did not visibly affect Black Diamond Pool or anything else close by. Scientists also pointed to a useful comparison from the same general period. A separate new pool had formed near Norris Geyser Basin in 2024, in that case through a straightforward ground collapse, essentially the same underlying process suspected in Biscuit Basin's new pool. In neither case did that new pool formation turn out to be the leading edge of some larger escalating event. New pools, in other words, are simply one of the more visually striking but genuinely ordinary ways this landscape periodically rearranges itself. Why does Biscuit Basin specifically keep doing this, though, given that it has now produced two notable hydrothermal events within about 2 years, along with an earlier one back in 2009? It helps to lay out that recent history plainly, because the pattern itself is part of what USGS points to when explaining why this area behaves the way IT does. The July 2024 explosion was the largest and most damaging of the recent events, ejecting rock identified as shallow glacial material, sandstone, siltstone, and gravel, rather than the deeper rhyolite bedrock, confirming that blast originated close to the surface. That event happened, with zero detected precursor activity. The June 2026 explosion, smaller and this time partially captured by instruments, followed a similar shallow mechanism, and then produced the new pool this video is centered on. 3 distinct events in roughly 17 years, 2 of them within 23 months of each other, is enough repetition that Poland explained the underlying geology directly. Biscuit Basin, and Black Diamond Pool in particular, sits on a system with a lot of boiling water positioned right at the interface between its liquid and steam phases, which he described as a genuine recipe for explosions, because it takes only a small increase in pressure to push that water above its boiling point and trigger a flash to steam. According to USGS records, Biscuit Basin and the area around Black Diamond Pool has been the site of numerous hydrothermal explosions for more than a century, meaning this location's tendency toward this kind of activity is a long, documented structural feature of the ground itself, not a new development or a sign that conditions underneath it have recently changed for the worse. It is also worth being precise about the distinction USGS scientists draw between this category of event and an actual volcanic hazard, because that distinction is the entire basis for their calm framing. Volcanoes, unlike hydrothermal explosions, generally do produce detectable warning signs before an eruption, things like sustained ground deformation, swarms of volcanic earthquakes, and changing gas emissions, patterns the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory monitors continuously and in detail. Following both the June explosion and the new pool that formed after it, USGS explicitly stated there were no signs of an imminent volcanic eruption and no unusual seismic activity anywhere in the broader Yellowstone region, with park officials confirming that volcanic activity across the system remained at completely normal background levels throughout. Hydrothermal explosions operate through an entirely separate mechanism, shallow, superheated water flashing suddenly to steam, unrelated to the deep magmatic system responsible for an actual volcanic eruption. The USGS has previously described this category of event through a simple analogy, something closer to a pressure cooker than a volcano, a shallow, localized process that can and does happen somewhere in Yellowstone roughly once or twice a year, often in the backcountry where it goes entirely unnoticed. Here is where the honest caveat behind that headline, not a warning sign yet, actually belongs, because it is important not to read USGS's calm framing as a guarantee that nothing bigger could ever happen. The agency has also been direct in the same public statements addressing this event that hydrothermal explosions are a genuinely underappreciated hazard, specifically because, unlike volcanoes, they may not give any warning signs at all before they occur. Striking with the kind of little to no notice that made the original 2024 explosion catch everyone in the area completely off guard. That is precisely why this particular event matters scientifically, independent of whether the new pool itself signals anything. The June explosion happened roughly 100 meters, about 328 feet, from a Biscuit Basin monitoring station installed in the summer of 2025, closer to instrumented monitoring equipment than any hydrothermal explosion in Yellowstone's recorded history. Scientists are now describing this proximity as an unprecedented opportunity, the best chance yet to comb through detailed seismic and infrasound data in the weeks that followed, searching specifically for any subtle precursor signals that might have hinted an explosion was coming, information that could eventually help researchers anticipate similar events elsewhere in the park or in comparable geothermal areas anywhere else in the world. So, what does all of this actually mean for you? Particularly if a Yellowstone trip is somewhere in your plans. It means treating the new pool exactly the way the scientists studying it are treating it, a genuinely interesting, actively monitored feature, rather than evidence that something catastrophic is quietly building beneath the surface, since the specific evidence USGS has laid out, a locally confined event, an unaffected Black Diamond Pool nearby, a documented pattern of comparable new pools forming elsewhere in the park without leading to anything larger, and continued normal background volcanic activity, does not support that reading. It also means understanding why Biscuit Basin remains closed to visitors regardless, since the underlying hazard, sudden hydrothermal, explosions capable of occurring with little to no warning, has not gone away simply because this particular pool is not itself flagged as an escalation signal. Respecting that closure, and any similar closure elsewhere in the park's thermal areas, remains the single most effective thing any visitor can actually do about a hazard that even the USGS's own instruments cannot always see coming in advance. It is also a genuinely useful habit for reading science coverage more broadly, distinguishing between what a research agency has actually stated on the record and what a headline or a short clip implies, since in this specific case, those two things point in noticeably different directions. The honest, grounded summary is this: a new thermal pool formed in Yellowstone's Biscuit Basin, sometime between the 14th and 16th of June this year, following a smaller hydrothermal explosion earlier that same week, and USGS scientist in charge, Michael Poland, has been explicit that new pools like this one form several times a year across the park, and do not, on their own, indicate that something larger is building underneath the area, nearby Black Diamond. Pool showed no changes during the same window. The broader Yellowstone region remained at normal background volcanic activity throughout, and a comparable new pool that formed near Norris Geyser Basin in 2024 did not lead to any escalating activity either. At the same time, USGS has been equally clear that hydrothermal explosions themselves remain a genuinely underappreciated hazard precisely because they can occur with little to no warning, which is exactly why this particular event, occurring unusually close to a dedicated monitoring station, is being treated as a valuable scientific opportunity to better understand the warning signs this hazard may or may not actually produce. We are going to keep tracking this as the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory's analysis continues, sourced the same way we did today, straight from the USGS, the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, and the geologists actually studying the system, not recycled headlines. Subscribe so you do not miss the next update, because based on how active Biscuit Basin has already been these past 2 years, this almost certainly will not be the last one. And leave that comment below. Tell me what you think of a new boiling pool showing up practically overnight where scientists had just been standing, because behind every one of these images is a geology team returning to a familiar patch of ground and finding it transformed in 48 hours. A monitoring station sitting closer to an active hydrothermal explosion than any instrument in the park's history, and a research group right now combing through weeks of seismic data, trying to find the faint signal that might one day give Yellowstone visitors the warning this event did not. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.